welcome back to another video. Today we got kind of a controversial one, okay? So I think that this is something that's very important to bring to light because to me, personal responsibility is very important. Also, the Black community is very important, and I think that the best way for us to lift ourselves up as individuals, as a collective, is through individualism, personal responsibility, okay? So this is one example to me. I mean, this can't be confirmed 100%, but this is just an example to me of people preying on our pain. So we see an example here of potentially someone getting rich off of people's pain, right? Taking in $90 million of donations, and then the families that you claim to be protesting for, they don't see any of that money. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at this founder, Patrice. We're going to look at her partner. We're going to look at where did all this money come from. We're going to look at potential sources of where this money came from. We're going to look at their job skills, and we're going to lastly do a comparison to Karl Marx. And why would we do a comparison to Karl Marx? Well, that is because she said this.
Frank is a concern about, in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
So since they are trained Marxist, and some people will say, oh no, that's capitalist. If you're getting all that money, what's wrong with them making money? I don't have any problem with people making money. What I have a problem with is when you don't provide any good or service, all you provide is basically fear, basically oppression. You're getting money in a dishonest way. For example, if I were to buy a Toyota for $30,000, I wouldn't be angry that they sold me that Toyota for that price because that's what I was willing to pay. I actually got something. But what are people getting from this organization? They're getting an individual that's buying a $1.4 million compound near Beverly Hills, which is only 1.4% Black. And as this commenter says down here, look at all that oppression. How does she keep on going with all that suffering? But this is what Marxism tends to look like. I mean, the people at the top are tremendously wealthy and powerful, while the people at the bottom just kind of have to rough it. Look at countries with peoples in the name or democratic republic in the name. This is what you see. People at the top having tremendous wealth and influence. People at the bottom struggling, having nothing, and being hopeful. The people at the top are all powerful, all wealthy, and the people at the bottom are completely under control. Okay, whether psychological, cultural, or otherwise, economic, there's no freedom there. So yes, the Black Lives Matter organization that we're talking about here, not the little subgroups which I've heard have popped up, and maybe they're doing good work. I haven't seen them specifically. There's some subgroups that don't necessarily answer to this group. But anyways, we're talking about this group. So how the heck could you fund a $1.4 million compound? This is where she's a teacher at. So we've got a $42K cost of attendance, and she's teaching people fine arts. Okay, so you're going to basically rack up $160K in student debt, and then you're going to go out with your arts degree. Okay, now this is something that, you know, people might get a little angry about, but I don't think you should be carrying around $160K in student debt with an art degree. So that's what she's pushing people towards. This is her source of revenue right here. All right, making books. There's nothing wrong with making books, but you have to question people's motive when, you know, their main source of revenue, like she's never had a job besides teaching and writing books. Okay, so she's a writer and activist, like that's her thing. Okay, if you go into her Wikipedia, all you see in career is teacher, and you see that she's a writer somewhere over here. I don't know where it's at. There you go. Activist, writer, playwright. Okay, so she basically makes money from oppression, and it makes sense. Like if you look at who they supported as an organization, they supported the Democratic Party, and they supported people like Bernie Sanders who want to eliminate student debt. I mean, look at all this student debt that she potentially accrued on her way, and all this student debt that her followers potentially have, right? $42K a year for the school that she teaches at. USC is about $30K per year after aid. All right, UCLA, that's where she went, about 14K after aid. Not too bad. But you see a common theme with this type of person who has, an arts degree or a philosophy degree, a religion degree. They just go out into society and they don't really have too many career prospects, so they just complain about stuff. Like, that is their career prospect, is using their knowledge to complain about stuff. So philosophy and religion, that's essentially what Karl Marx studied. But we'll get into that in a later part of the video. So just to be fair, I decided, hey, maybe her partner makes a bunch of money. And I looked at what she did for school. She went to York University, which is one of the top 5 most expensive schools in Toronto. So York University is about $27,000 a year. So if we assume that that was financed with student debt, she probably accrued about somewhere between $108,000 to $75,000 in student debt. Whereas Patrice, say maybe she had a little bit of student debt, let's say it was about 50. So they might have accrued like $150K in student debt. It kind of makes sense why you would want to support Bernie and the people on that end of the spectrum if you're accruing all this student debt and you have an English degree, which the average earnings for an English major, I looked it up and it's about $48,000. Okay, so average for a master's in fine arts, $73K. So if you add those together, it's about $120,000 that they make per year. So let's check this out. Max DTI that you can have for a conventional loan on a house. This is assuming that they put 20% down. It's 45%. So given this payment, this is how much they would have to earn per year to support that payment. All right. And they don't necessarily make that with not having a job. So where's the money coming from? What's their income source and how much they're actually getting? They're not really being transparent with that, but they are buying a $1.4 million mansion. Okay. Was this paid for cash? I mean, where did the money come from? You really have to ask yourself that question. So anyways, let's get into part 2 of this video. Got this highlighted over here because, as we see here, philosophy and literature. Okay, Karl Marx supported himself. He didn't support himself, but he wanted to study philosophy and literature. His father insisted on a more practical field, but as we're going to get into, he's very similar. I want you guys to take note of the similarities between Marx and the similarities between these two individuals who are now buying a $1.4 million mansion based on people's donations. Up to $90 million of donations were processed through Black Lives Matter, and now it's, somehow they're in this mansion. All right, so check it out. We got about 11 slides here, and we're just going to go through these really quick. So Marx the man. This is going to go through basically Marx's young life and his finances, also a little bit of his morality, looking into his psyche so that you can kind of identify what was really under the hood on this man's brain when he was making all of these policies that we see what is the end result of these Marxist socialist policies. The people at the top are getting a $1.4 million mansion, and the people at the bottom are wondering, what the heck, where's the money for us, okay? Where's the money for Ahmaud Arbery's family? Where's the money for all these families that they claim to protest for? I don't see that, but I do see this mansion. Okay. Marx the man. I live too expensively for my circumstances. That is a quote from Marx, and it basically just says that he was supported by his parents, but no matter how much money they sent him, he always spent more. So the point of this slide, basically Marx, he came from a wealthy family. He came from a position of privilege. They had servants, they had property, they had education, and they had local prominence. So he basically became disillusioned with his religion. She also became disillusioned with her religion from her parents, right? They were Jehovah's Witnesses. So she turned against Christianity. That's another thing that they have in common. These other things not as relevant. He's bullied in childhood, and he had a dark complexion that earned him the nickname the Moor. So Marx, he attended Bonn University for a year, at which he was an avid drinker and took part in at least one duel. He's a big egomaniac and an avid atheist. He was transferred over to the University of Berlin, where he continued his huge spending habits, and his parents financed all of it. He was sued several times for non-payment of debts, and eventually, after taking the scenic route through college, he got a doctorate degree and stumbled into a job with a political newspaper. So eventually Marx moves over to Paris, where he started a job writing for a journal, but him and the editor quarreled and broke up. He basically ended up broke after he lost that job, and he had to take up collection from friends, as would be the course many times over their life. Marx joined a lot of revolutionary organizations in which he was known as an egomaniac and a dictator. The Communist Manifesto, February 1848. So as it says here, the Communist Manifesto was published with no offers and made to appear to have been written by a large organization rather than a handful of radical refugees and intellectuals who are professionals with an average age under 30 with no job experience. So basically, a bunch of young, privileged individuals who were intellectuals got together and they wrote this communist manifesto about how evil work is and about how evil the capitalists are. And Marx basically goes on to be broke, to be in debt, to not pay his rent, to not pay his debts, and he continuously is pursued by collections, and he calls himself a member of the proletariat. So as we see down here, the document would later go on to be cited by youthful offspring of privilege that would call themselves the proletariat. And lastly, Engels ran for election in the Communist Party in an unopposed election that he claimed to be elected by the working man, but really he was elected because it was an unopposed election. So a little bit about the psyche of Engels, who's the other writer of the Communist Manifesto, which is Marxism, which is what they claim to follow over at Black Lives Matter, is that he was a well-known womanizer. Okay, so at points in his life, Engels was engaged in armed revolution. Like it says right here, Marx had several failed businesses and generally jobs and whatnot, and he had to liquidate his newspaper with ruinous losses, and Engels basically paid off his debts, and eventually Engels would go to bail Marx out at age 50 by giving him an annuity, but we'll get into that later. So by age 32 and age 30, Marx and Engels respectively had never paid their own way through life. So how did they pay their way through life? They lived on allowances from their parents, gifts, including Marx's wife's family, the sale of goods, borrowings, credit defaults, emergency collections from their friends and colleagues, and a few scattered, meager earnings from their writings. Another instance of Marx not understanding how to handle his money, 1849. His mom advanced him enough of his inheritance to live for several years, and he spent it all in 1 year on his newspaper and on armed uprisings, which were aborted. At age 30, Engels was offered a job from his father, which he described as forced labor. Okay, so his dad offered him a job, and he described it as forced labor, and he complained that he had to be at work no later than 10 in the morning. So this is the type of people we're talking about here that wrote this manifesto that people still seem to think is a good idea. And like we said earlier, by the age of 50, Engels was able to retire and give Marx an annuity, which he so desperately needed. So a little bit more about how Marx lived a very poor life. He had to live in the slums, and he frequently dodged creditors. They were evicted for non-payment of rent. They had to live on bread and potatoes. They had 3 children die in their infancy and early childhood, and they often had to pawn their meager belongings. So Marx's income at that time was about 3 times that of an unskilled worker, but he still lived in poverty because he spent so much of his money so quickly, which is very characteristic of someone who grew up in privilege and or never had to support themselves by actually working a job and actually supporting themselves, right? That never was allowed to fall flat on their face. And lastly, throughout Marx's life, Engels financially supported Marx and supplemented his income. So the disasters continue to pile up. In 1964, Karl Marx received multiple inheritances that added up to more than 10 times what he'd been living on annually. But by 1868, which is 4 years later, he was in debt, and Engels had to bail him out again and provide him an annuity. He blamed everything on the bourgeoisie, including the death of his infant son. Even though he was unsanitary and had boils on his body, he blamed them on the bourgeoisie and vowed that they would pay for his removal. He was a drunk, and even when his family was completely poor, they still had a housemaid who, funny story about that, the housemaid mysteriously became pregnant around the same time that his wife became pregnant, and they blamed it on Engels until Engels was on his deathbed and he revealed that the son was Marx. So he was Marx's baby, and they just kept it a secret so that they could save his marriage. The child was sent away to live with a middle-class family. So some of Marx's colleagues basically cited that anytime that he didn't agree with what you had to say, he would either question your motives, he would say that you're a bad person, or he would just say that you're completely ignorant of his theories, right? So that sounds very familiar to people that follow his type of philosophy. And one of the last things that's very telling, given his life story, is that he wanted to end the dependence of the wife on the husband, and he wanted to end the dependence of the child on the parents. So it really makes sense when you take into account he was dependent on his parents for basically his whole life, and then he was dependent on his friend for the rest of his life. And the last thing I wanted to share with you guys, especially given certain black groups like the Nation of Islam with their anti-Semitic leadership, is that part of Marx's philosophy was he wanted to abolish capitalism because, like we said earlier, he wanted to turn away from his religion and he wanted to abolish the essence of Jewry. Okay, so that is a quote from Karl Marx himself. So anyways, with all that said, hopefully you guys learned something about Marxism. Hope you guys learned about this $1.4 million mansion that was funded by Unknown. And I'll see some of you guys in the next video.